Hello, Warhawk. So today we are going to look at the Age of Reform as our review, and there's a lot here. Uh, the Industrial Revolution has lots and lots of questions over it. The Age of Reform usually has fewer, maybe three questions, two or three questions a year on this, but it kind of spans. They do a lot of different topics, and so we've got to cover a lot of different things here because you never know which particular type of question might be on there. Um, so, so one of the things we start with when we talk about the Age of Reform is the Second Great Awakening, because it is the Second Great Awakening that really encouraged people to get involved in these other reform movements in many ways. But just to remind us, because if they do ask you about the Second Great Awakening, that's not usually what they ask you about. That's the important thing, in my opinion, but that's not the main thing they ask you about. They ask you about what it is. Like they'll describe it perhaps like it was tent meetings and people had a lot of religious fervor and feeling, and they would travel around to these different locations all around the country and doing these movements or revival meetings. The Second Great Awakening is this religious movement. Okay, and so that is what the Second Great Awakening is, and they don't ask about it a lot, but if they do, that's kind of usually what they're looking for. Now, prison reform and mental illness reform, they've only asked a question about this one time. And this is, Dorothea Dix is known for this, her working for better treatment of the mentally ill and working to, improve conditions in both for the mentally ill. Elizabeth Farnham worked to improve conditions for prisoners. And so that's we're not going to spend a lot of time there. Now, the temperance movement. There's a couple of important things here with the temperance movement. One is recognizing that alcohol was a problem. It was a real problem at this time. The consumption of alcohol was really high in the United States at that time, and even more so than it is today. And alcohol certainly causes problems for people today as well. The things to recognize here, though, is the temperance movement is one, it's about trying to spread the word and either ending the consumption of alcohol, the outright prohibition, or at least the reduction of alcohol. So temperance and alcohol, that's the first thing you need to know. The second thing you need to know is that you'll notice it was primarily women that are working and to fight for the decrease of the consumption of alcohol. They were the ones that, in many cases, often suffered the most because of the results of alcohol, and therefore they recognized the problems of it. And so they worked and really gained, and this is key here, is that gained a lot of leadership opportunities in this temperance movement, and therefore use this experience in fighting for the prohibition of alcohol, or at least the temperance of alcohol, to become leaders in other reform movements like the women's rights movement. All right. The main thing you need to know about the education movement here is that education is seen then as it is today as the great equalizer. And Horace Mann is kind of the big proponent of public education, that if we can educate as many people as possible, then we will help bring up a lot of people out of poverty and give them an opportunity. And so public education was the key to doing that and bettering the lives of the children across America. This was a time when lots of people didn't go to school for very long. They maybe get an elementary education. A very few would get more than that. And so he was a big proponent of public education and getting people this opportunity to have an education. Now, one of the most significant reform movements during this time is the Abolitionist. Are William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. They both, one of the things that's interesting, they both actually had their own newspaper that they published arguing for and fighting for abolition. William Lloyd Garrison, his newspaper was the Liberator. Frederick Douglass's was the North Star. And they worked, tirelessly to end slavery. They both had strong opinions. They actually were friends and then kind of had some conflict over things and didn't always see eye to eye, but they were working for the same goal ultimately, which is the abolition of slavery. They just didn't always agree on the best way to go about it. But both very passionate in their desire to see slavery stopped and ended, and recognizing the injustice of it. Other abolitionists are Harriet Beecher Stowe, who writes the famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. And one of the things that her novel does is it brings recognition to the horrors of slavery. A lot of people at this time would kind of believe the lie that, slavery wasn't that bad, and there was a lot of good slaveholders that really didn't, took care of their slaves. And she showed that through her story that, slavery really was an awful situation to find yourself in, and was brutal, and was very, and people saw this and maybe would accept it from her more than they might from perhaps somebody like Frederick Douglass, who wrote his own autobiography about it. But him being an African-American man, they may not accept his, whereas her being a white woman, they might. Now, not certainly many in the South did not. They said, what does she know about slavery? She doesn't know slavery. She hasn't been here. But of course, she did actually go and interview lots of former slaves as part of her preparation for writing this story. Sojourner Truth, herself a former slave, was a slave in New York, and she worked to end slavery as long as she could. She also was a women's rights advocate, and a powerful one. She was a powerful speaker, tall woman, powerful woman, and argued powerfully for the rights of the slave and then the rights for women as well. The Underground Railroad is, many of you should be quite familiar with this. It's the routes that people would take to try to escape slavery and get to Canada. It was not an actual railroad that was underground, to be clear. It was these secret hideouts and stations along the way that people would go from one to the other. And the way they kept it secret by, you didn't really know who all was involved. You knew who you would send somebody. If you were closer to Kentucky, across the Ohio River, you knew where they might come from, and you knew where they might go to, but you didn't know anything beyond that. Harriet Tubman is the most famous of the conductors of the Underground Railroad. She went back into slavery, or into the South, several times to help free friends and family and as many people as she could to get them out of harm's way in the slave South. And then finally, we get to Transcendentalism. So Ralph Waldo Emerson is kind of the founder of this movement. Transcendentalists believe in listening to your inner self, your conscience, your inner light, doing what is right, not just what is listening to society or our institutions that might say it. And one of the reasons was this issue of slavery. Well, if our country says slavery is okay, obviously our institutions are failing because we know this is wrong. Our conscience tells us this is wrong, so we should listen to that and recognize that. Henry David Thoreau is the most famous of transcendentalists. He was opposed to the U.S.-Mexican War, and so he refuses to pay his taxes, and this is called civil disobedience. And he's put in jail because he didn't pay his taxes because he felt like it would go to support that war. And so he says, nope, not going to do it. It will support this war. This war will ultimately lead to the growth of slavery. and it's unjust, and so I'm not going to support this country with my tax dollars. And so he's put in prison. Ultimately, some of his friends end up paying his taxes for him, and he is released, but he didn't ask them to. Although he does accept it and go free. All right, so, and that's there we go. That next slide shows what I was just talking about. I forgot I had this slide on here. All right, now, the women's rights movement in the 1800s. We have women did not have the right to vote and therefore didn't have a voice in their government. And Susan B. Anthony worked to change that. She saw that, without the right to vote, without the ability to go to, without the right to go to school in many cases, that women would always be seen and treated as second class. And she worked to change that in a powerful way. Other important members, people that were leaders of the women's rights movement and the right to vote or suffrage. Suffrage has got nothing to do with suffering. It's a different spelling. Suffrage means the right to vote. Women's suffrage means women gaining the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, which is a first meeting of the women's rights movement. Big meeting where they meet to declare, following after the Declaration of Independence, they write the Declaration of Sentiments, which asks for women to be treated the same as men and to have the right to vote. So that finishes up our review of the reform movements of the first half of U.S. history.